Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this WorkSafe Saskatchewan research presentation. Today, we are excited to have Dr. Andrea Jones joining us from the University of British Columbia to share results from her recent dissertation research. My name is Sean Tucker. I coordinate research for the Workers' Compensation Board in Saskatchewan. And today, I'd like to begin with land acknowledgement. We're meeting virtually in different parts of Western Canada, in Regina, Saskatoon, and also on the coast, the West Coast. And so if you're in Regina and Saskatoon, you would be in Treaty 4 and Treaty 6, respectively. And these encompass the traditional territories of the Cree, Dene, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Ojibwe, Dakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. On the West Coast, in Vancouver, this is the unceded traditional home of the Musqueam, the Coast Salish people generally, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Wet'suwet'en. Sorry, I'm not mispronouncing that.
Tooth, I think.
Wet'suwet'en. Thank you, Andrea. So Andrea recently completed her doctorate at the University of British Columbia in the School of Population and Public Health. And we all know about public health now. I first met Andrea during my 2017 sabbatical and sat in on a presentation of her dissertation research and was fascinated by it and said, we'd love to have you present in Saskatchewan, and we have Andrea here today to share the final results of her research. So Dr. Jones's research investigated the impacts of mental health disorders on work disability outcomes after work-related musculoskeletal injury with a specific focus on sex and gender. Dr. Jones holds a Bachelor of Science and Master's of Science in Kinesiology from McMaster University in Ontario. Her research interests include workforce mental health, work disability policy, and morbidity, and the social determinants of health in a work and occupation context. Currently, Dr. Jones works in occupational health research at the Partnership for Work and Health and Safety, and I will put a link to that center on the chat if you're not aware of the partnership. It's an excellent institute for current cutting edge research on occupational health and safety. And Dr. Jones also works with the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrea. Thank you again for making time to join us. Look forward to the presentation. I understand it'll be about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A and discussion at the end. Thank you, Andrea.
Hi, thanks so much, and thank you, Lisa. And thanks everyone for coming in and participating today. I'm just going to share my screen here. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay, let's try it.
Looks like it's coming on now. Perfect. I think we're
okay. Sorry. Oh, geez.
Take your time.
Window. There we go. There we go. Okay, so now do you probably, do you see just the slides or also the notes?
Well, it's not on the presentation mode currently, so I think it would be on the slide mode or the,
Okay,
if there's a way to zoom in to,
how's that?
perfect. That's
Okay,
great.
thanks everybody. We actually did do a dry run yesterday, which went much smoother for some reason. Yeah, so thank you. I think Sean did a very thorough introduction, so I'll jump right into it. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the contribution of my supervisor as well as my thesis committee, as well as the various sources of funding and support. So this includes the Partnership for Work Health and Safety, WorkSafe BC, the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy, the Bridge Program, and Population Data BC. As a disclaimer, all inferences, opinions, and conclusions drawn in this presentation are those of my own and the co-authors, and they don't necessarily reflect the opinions or policies of the data stewards or the study funders. At the bottom of this screen, you'll see the presentation outline, which first I'll go over a brief overview of the background literature. Then I'll summarize the methods used for the current research. Then I'll present the results. And then lastly, will be a summary of the main findings, the strengths and limitations of the research, as well as the implications. So this slide is a very broad overview of mental health and musculoskeletal conditions. The most common types of mental health disorders are depression and anxiety disorders. In a given year, approximately 1 in 10 Canadian adults is affected by clinical anxiety or depression. As a broad category of conditions, mental and substance use disorders, according to the World Health Organization, are the #1 leading cause of years lived with disability worldwide. If we jump down to musculoskeletal conditions, once again, according to the World Health Organization, approximately 1 in 4 adults lives with a painful musculoskeletal condition globally. And then musculoskeletal conditions as a broad group are the 2nd leading cause of years lived with disability worldwide, second only to mental and substance use disorders. Something that I find interesting about these two types of conditions is not only are they each very common and associated with disability in their own right, but they also tend to frequently co-occur. So what this means is that if you have a musculoskeletal condition, you're more likely to have an anxiety or depression disorder than someone with no musculoskeletal condition. In particular, there's a very strong link between low back pain and depression. So for my thesis, I was particularly interested in looking at workers with lost time work injury, so a physical injury, so workers that are experiencing work disability due to a physical injury, and looking at their experiences of anxiety and depression. So this slide is a very condensed summary of the entire literature review for my thesis. So what I found is that there was already quite a bit of literature on this topic, and I found that studies tended to use study samples of workers that had already been off work for a while. So the study samples tended to include workers that had already entered the phase of chronic work disability or who had some sort of permanent impairment. I also found that they tended to measure depression and anxiety using self-reported symptoms, including the timing of symptoms, and anxiety and depression were always measured in the post-injury time period. So the main findings of these studies were that studies do tend to find a high prevalence of both depression and anxiety among these workers post-injury. And so that means that the frequency of anxiety and depression in these injured worker populations is higher than in comparable general populations. One thing that's interesting is that based on self-reported symptoms, the literature does suggest that the physical work injury is a stimulus for new onset depression post-injury. So a very high proportion of workers self-report that their depression began post-injury. The similar evidence for anxiety was very mixed, and there wasn't a consensus across studies. In regards to the impacts of anxiety and depression on return to work after a lost time work injury, to me, when I started out on this research, it seemed quite intuitive that they would be associated with poor return to work. But I was quite surprised to find that the literature was very mixed. Indeed, there are certain studies that say that they are. So one study by French et al. In Ontario did find that new onset depressive symptoms post-injury were associated with a more complicated return to work trajectory. But there's even more studies suggesting that they're not associated. And there's been quite a few systematic reviews on this topic, and they tend to conclude either insufficient evidence or no impact. So one of the most comprehensive systematic reviews was conducted by Isles et al. In 2008. So they looked at the impact, the associations of depression and anxiety with failure to return to work after non-chronic, non-specific low back pain injury. And they found moderate evidence that anxiety was not associated and strong evidence that depression was not associated. So that intrigued me quite a bit, and it definitely formed my research objectives. So even though the literature doesn't necessarily suggest an association between depression and anxiety with return to work after lost time musculoskeletal injury, there are certainly several potential mechanisms described in the literature that explain how they might impact return to work. So first of all, when anxiety and depression co-occur with a physical pain condition, they're known to exacerbate the pain associated with the physical condition. Another is activity disruption. So an actual symptom of depression and anxiety is ceasing to participate in activities that you previously participated in. So these could include activities that promote general well-being and in turn promote return to work, or they could even include rehabilitation activities such as attending physiotherapy. The next is resistance to treatment. There was one study by Slepian et al. that looked at workers with a physical work injury, and they found that those with high anxiety and depression symptoms did not respond as favorably to a physical treatment modality. The next is beliefs regarding return to work. So one's self-perceived ability to return to work is a very strong predictor of actual return to work outcomes. And when you think about the actual symptoms of depression and anxiety, such as a negative outlook, excessive worry, feelings of hopelessness, you could see how that might lead to a lower perception of one's ability to return to work. The next is stigmatization, and this is explained by Nancy Carnide in her paper. And she explains that even though workers might be off work due to a physical injury, they might encounter negative reactions to their anxiety and depressive symptoms during the return to work process. So this could be negative reactions from coworkers, managers, or actors in the workers' compensation system. And this could negatively impact their process of return to work. And then lastly, workers with depression and anxiety might actually have a greater need for work accommodation than people that aren't dealing with this additional, added health, mental health issue on top of their physical health issue. So you'll see in the bottom right corner, I've highlighted sex and gender. So for my thesis, I really wanted to focus on how men and women might experience depression and anxiety differently following a work injury. So I just want to take a moment to hypothesize about some of the mechanisms and how they might be affected differently. So one example for men is they are known on average to have lower help-seeking behavior. So this, if they do have depression or anxiety, it might be more likely to go untreated. They might also be less likely to receive mental health-related social support from their peers or their family or their coworkers. So this could allow their mental health symptoms to grow more severe, which could then impact the probability of return to work. Another one for men, these are hypotheses, is that men do tend to have higher occupational expectations. So if you combine these high occupational expectations with symptoms of anxiety and depression, such as fear or excessive worry, you might get a perfect storm, so to speak, where it actually makes returning to work become a higher hurdle to get over. On the contrary, if we think about women, even in recent years, women do continue to contribute to a higher number of unpaid labor hours in their lives. And when you think about this, this might deplete this higher time spent in unpaid labor. It might deplete their emotional, their motivational, or even their physical resources that they might otherwise put towards rehabilitation and working towards returning to work. And this effect might be even greater for women who have a mental health disorder like depression and anxiety, who might already be running a little bit low on those sorts of resources. So I mentioned earlier that there is quite a bit of research in this topic, but the existing studies, they do tend to have quite small clinical samples that are often recruited from like a tertiary treatment clinic. They tend to focus on workers that have already entered chronic work disability or who have permanent impairment. Anxiety and depression measurement tends to be, not all studies, but it tends to be based on self-reported mental symptoms and timing. And there are certain biases, including recall bias, that could affect those results. They do tend to have short follow-up, sometimes as short as 1 month, or they sometimes only look at the first return to work event and nothing beyond that. And also there has been a limited focus on anxiety. Depression has definitely received much more attention in the literature than anxiety. And that's not just limited to the return to work literature, that's also quite true of the broader mental health and disability literature. And then lastly, there hasn't been any focus on recurrence of time lost. So I specifically wanted to also look at, once a worker has gone back to work, does having a comorbid depression or anxiety disorder, does it affect their ability to stay at work once they're there? And then lastly, I think research of this nature, if anxiety and depression are associated with return to work, I think they're a modifiable risk factor. So there is the potential to improve return to work outcomes. So these are the specific research objectives. So for the study sample, I focused on workers with lost time, upper extremity or spine strain or sprain. I often get asked, like, why did you choose spine strain or sprain? And the reason was it is the most common type of lost time claim in British Columbia. And also the largest, it accounts for a very large proportion of costs associated with lost time as well. I didn't want to include too many different injury types in the study sample because I think that we might see different results for different types of injuries. So say if we looked at an injury type that has a different return to work prognosis, we might see different patterns. So just keep in mind that these results are specific to upper extremity and spine strain or sprain. In particular, I wanted to look at the prevalence of anxiety and depression disorders, their timing relative to the injury, and also risk factors for these disorders. I wanted to look at the impacts of anxiety and depression on return to work, as well as to break down the actual return to work trajectory into more detail and look at specific events in the overall return to work trajectory. So look at their impact on the ability to go back to non-modified work from time loss, as well as the impact of these disorders on the ability to stay at work once back there. So look at their impact on the probability of time loss recurrence. And then lastly, I wanted to look at differences between men and women for the above measures and relationships. All right, so to conduct this study, I used linked administrative data from Population Data BC. So Population Data BC has fairly comprehensive data holdings for all residents of British Columbia. So I used a combination of linked data sets from the British Columbia Workers' Compensation Board, WorkSafe BC, as well as the Ministry of Health. So I used data from the Workers' Compensation Board to identify workers that had a spine or upper extremity strain or sprain lost time workers' compensation claim. I also used the workers' compensation data to measure their return to work outcomes. I used a combination of pharmaceutical dispensing events, hospitalization data, as well as physician billing data to identify workers that had depression and anxiety. And then lastly, there was, from the administrative data, a pretty wide range of demographic variables available, which I'll go over in a future slide. So for the study cohort, we looked at claims from 2000 to 2013. And for that time range, we had just under 300,000 claims. Over half of the sample, 60%, was men. The most common age was, most people fell between the ages of 30 to 59. Over half of the sample had a prior claim. And then when we look at differences in the characteristics of men in the sample compared to women in the sample, men were more likely to have high income. They were less likely to have any somatic comorbidities, so like another physical health condition. And they were more likely to work in trades or manufacturing or utilities-based occupations. The women were more likely to have low income, to have a high number of somatic comorbidities, and also more likely to work in sales or services or health occupations. For the analyses that focused on return to work, we had a smaller sample size because we only had detailed return to work data available from 2009 onward. So from 2009 to 2013, we had a sample size of just under 85,000. All right, so this is the case definitions. I'm going to go over how we define depression and anxiety in the current study because I think it is a fairly defining feature of the research. So we had a combination of healthcare events that we used to identify depression and anxiety. On the right of this slide, you'll see 4 green boxes. So everyone in the study sample was classified as either none, which means no depression and no anxiety, or having anxiety only, depression only, or both anxiety and depression. So to be considered to have anxiety, we looked at people's diagnoses associated with their hospitalization, and we identified if there were any anxiety diagnoses in their hospitalizations. We also looked at their physician billing data to identify any anxiety diagnoses in that. And then lastly, we looked at pharmaceutical data to identify pharmaceutical dispensing events for anxiolytics or antidepressants. So both anxiolytics and antidepressants are actually first-line treatments for anxiety. So to be considered to actually have anxiety, you either had to have a single hospitalization was sufficient to be considered to have anxiety. However, a single physician visit or a single pharmaceutical dispensing event was not enough on its own. So at a minimum, you had to have at least either 2 physician visits or 1 physician visit plus a pharmaceutical event within 365 days of each other. So this made the case definitions a bit more rigorous and made us more certain that the people in the mental health groups actually had that mental health disorder. And we used a similar method for depression, with the exception that we were focused on depression diagnoses and antidepressants. This is a summary of the analytic methods. I don't want to spend too much time on them, but feel free to ask questions about them. I'm happy to talk about them. So in summary, we used a combination of regression models as well as survival curves to conduct the analysis. All of the analyses were conducted for men and women separately. So men were always compared to men and women were always compared to women. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see the study covariates. So I just want to point out that due to the richness of the administrative data, we were able to account for a large number of potential confounders from the socio-demographic, injury-related areas, clinical confounders, as well as work-related confounders. Okay, so moving on to the results here. So first I'm going to talk about the prevalence. So first we wanted to look at, how many people are coming into their work injury, how many people already have an anxiety or depression disorder or a very recent anxiety or depression disorder at the time of their injury. So we found that 13% of men and 29% of women had an met our case definitions for one of anxiety or depression or both in the 1 year before injury. You'll see in the graph that the bars for women, which are orange, are about for at least for the anxiety and depression groups, are about twice as high as the men's bars. So women were about twice as likely to have anxiety or depression than men. And this is to be expected. We see this pattern in the general population as well. So one thing that in past presentations, have been asked from stakeholders are these measures high? You know, like are people that have musculoskeletal lost time strain or sprain, are they actually more likely to have anxiety and depression than other people? And it's a very hard question to answer because there's no good comparison group. My study data was limited to people that had claims. And then other studies also tend to use different case definitions for anxiety and depression, but the most comparable estimates I can get are from the Public Health Agency of Canada. Does have a surveillance system for anxiety and depression that they use based on administrative data, much like in this study. And based on that, they found that men and women between the ages of 20 to 65, about 9% of men and 16% of women have one of anxiety or depression or both, which is certainly lower than these estimates here, especially for the women. And one of the things I want to point out is those estimates are actually based on, in their measurement, a single anxiety or depression healthcare event was sufficient to be ruled in as having the condition. So our estimates are actually a lot more rigorous. So the differences might actually be even bigger. So in summary, I do think, although I don't have a perfect comparison group, I do think that these estimates are quite high. All right, so this slide is comparing the prevalence in the year before injury to the year after injury. So you can see that for anxiety and depression, for both men and women, we saw about a 2 to 3% increase in these diagnosed anxiety and depression disorders in the year after injury compared to the year before. So this actually did surprise me a little bit based on the existing literature. I had actually hypothesized that we would see a much more dramatic increase. And the absence of a dramatic increase might in part be due to the fact that we're looking at clinically diagnosed disorders and not necessarily symptoms, some of which might be subclinical. So if we were to look at symptoms rather than diagnosed disorders, we might see a different pattern. This is the risk factor profile. So this is a list of factors in our analyses that were associated with pre-existing anxiety and depression. So the workers that were the most likely to have pre-existing anxiety and depression, or as you saw in the first slide, was women were more likely to have anxiety and depression than men. Older age, especially middle age, was associated with pre-existing anxiety and depression. Lower income, somatic comorbidities, other mental disorders, so other mental disorders that aren't anxiety or depression, having a prior claim, and then the healthcare occupations and the social science, education, and government occupations were associated with a higher probability of pre-existing anxiety and depression among these workers with lost time musculoskeletal claims. So nothing about this slide really surprised us. We do know that in the general population, these are also risk factors for anxiety and depression. So this was very much as expected. For the occupation, healthcare, as well as social science, education, government, there is a little bit of literature demonstrating that depression in particular is a bit higher among these caring professions. I think a main takeaway from this slide is to, when we start to think about facilitating return to work for workers that have a comorbid anxiety or depression disorder, in addition to their lost time injury, is that they are more likely to be lower income, which could be relevant when we think about access to mental health resources, as well as they do have a more complicated clinical profile. All right, so there were some gender-specific risk factors. So what this means is there were some variables that were associated with the probability of pre-existing anxiety and depression among men only. So we didn't find these associations in women. And then likewise, there were some variables that were associated in women only. So for men, we found having a multi-site injury, so having a secondary diagnosis on the claim, was associated with a higher probability of pre-existing anxiety and depression, as well as being employed by a larger firm. For women, having a dependent was associated with an higher probability of pre-existing anxiety. Being from a rural area was associated with an increased probability of depression. And then working in a business, finance, or administrative occupation for women was associated with a higher probability of anxiety and depression. The only thing that was really surprising about this slide was the rural area being a risk factor for depression in women. As in general, the literature is a bit mixed, but the literature suggests that people that live in rural areas either have a similar probability of anxiety and depression compared to people in urban areas, or they actually have a lower probability. So the literature suggests that living in a rural area might be a little bit protective. But in this study, we did find that it was a risk factor for women, and we're not sure why, but we can hypothesize. And we thought that it might be due to, in British Columbia, a lot of industry in rural areas. It's very you know, there's a lot of primary resources work, and these do tend to be very male-dominated industry. So there might be mental health risks associated with that for women workers. Okay, so now we're moving on here. Here I'm looking at the associations of pre-existing anxiety and depression on the probability of sustained return to work. So we found that on the left here, we look at men in blue, and the comparison group is men with no anxiety and no depression. And these are hazard ratios. So we're comparing, so for the second dot here, for men with anxiety only, we're comparing the probability of sustained return to work for men with anxiety only compared to the comparison group, which is men with no anxiety and no depression. So if the probability of sustained return to work for men with anxiety only was the same as men with no anxiety and no depression, the dot for this hazard ratio should be on the line of 1. But as you can see, it's quite below the line of 1. So what this means is that men with anxiety only have a lower probability of sustained return to work compared to men with no anxiety and no depression. If we look over at men with depression only and men with anxiety and depression, we also see that they have a lower probability of sustained return to work than men with neither of these mental disorders. If we look over at women, we see a similar pattern of effect in that the women with the anxiety or depression disorders are less likely to return to work, with the exception that the hazard ratio for depression is very close to 1. So I would say that there was no effect for depression among women. Another thing that I want to point out in this slide is that the effect sizes are larger for men. So the men's hazards ratios are lower. They're farther away from 1 than the women's, and this was statistically significant for the anxiety only group. So what this means is that having anxiety is having a stronger negative impact on the probability of return to work among men than it is among women. This slide is actually the exact same as the previous slide, except it's looking at the effect on a different scale. So the scale is the number of days. I find it's a bit easier to kind of look at the effect size on this type of scale to help determine the policy relevance. So men with no anxiety and no depression, the none group over here, took just over 30 days, maybe 32 days, to reach sustained return to work. That was the median time for that group. The median time for men with anxiety only was in the high 40s in terms of days. So there was an excess of 14 days. So men with anxiety only took 2 weeks longer to reach sustained return to work than men with no anxiety and no depression. Among men with depression and anxiety and depression, there was an excess of 1 week until time to sustained return to work compared to men with none. When we look at women, we can really see here that the effect sizes are quite small. Our mental health groups only had an excess of between 2 to 5 days among women. Okay, so the last 2 slides we're looking at the association of pre-existing anxiety and depression on time to sustained return to work. This analysis on this slide, this is limited to people that had no anxiety or depression healthcare events whatsoever in the year prior to their injury. So this is limited to people with no pre-existing anxiety or depression, and it's looking at the impacts of new onset anxiety or depression that develop during the return to work process. So we identified people that had no previous anxiety or depression in the year before injury, and then we identified those that developed a new onset anxiety or depression disorder well off work, but before return to work. And you can see in this slide that indeed anxiety and depression for all of the mental health groups, for both men and women, were associated with a lower probability of sustained return to work. And the effect sizes here are quite dramatic. They're larger than in the other slides. So we can see that these new onset disorders are associated with a strong decrease in the probability of sustained return to work. Like in the other slide, the effects are a little bit stronger, a little bit weaker for women than for men, so that you can see the women's hazard ratios are all a bit closer to 1 than the men's. However, we didn't test for statistical significance in that case. We didn't test to see if the differences between men and women were statistically significant for this analysis, but we can see visually descriptively that the women's do tend towards having smaller effect sizes. Okay, so for the third objective, so the previous two slides were looking at the impacts of these mental health disorders on time to sustained return to work. So I mentioned earlier that I also looked at once workers had gone back to work, how do anxiety and depression affect the probability of going back onto time loss? So in this case, so it's a bit reversed in terms of the directions of the hazard ratio. So having a hazard ratio greater than 1 would indicate a higher probability of time loss, which in general we don't want. So you want to get back to work and ideally stay at work. So we can see that for men, men with anxiety compared to men with no anxiety and more depression had a higher risk of time loss recurrence once back at work, as well as men with anxiety and depression together, comorbid, also had a higher probability of time loss. Depression for both women and men had no effect on time loss, and overall the pattern of results here is quite similar for women and men in that we're finding effects for anxiety as well as comorbid anxiety and depression on increased probability of time loss recurrence. So a summary of my finding, there was a very high prevalence, I think, of recent or current anxiety and depression episodes in the year prior to injury. So approximately 1/3 of women and 10% of men. Surprisingly, the injury was not a major stimulus for new onset clinically diagnosed disorders, and this could be due to the fact that we're only looking at new onset clinically diagnosed disorders. That being said, there was an increase in the post-injury prevalence of anxiety and depression, so we did see an increase of about 2 to 3%. In regards to the impacts on sustained return to work, pre-existing anxiety was associated with a lower probability of sustained return to work for both men and women, and these effects were significantly stronger for men. We also found that among men, depression was associated with a lower probability of sustained return to work, and comorbid anxiety and depression was associated with a lower probability of sustained return to work for both men and women. In regards to new onset disorders, for both men and women, all three of the mental health groups had a lower probability of sustained return to work, and these effects were quite dramatic, more so than for the pre-existing disorders. And then lastly, when we looked at the risk of time loss recurrence, for both women and men, we saw effects for anxiety only, as well as comorbid anxiety and depression. So the strengths of this research, we do have access to it. It was based on longitudinal population-based data, so we didn't have to rely on self-report for symptoms, including the timing of symptom onset. So we were able to look at the timing of the conditions a little bit differently than most studies. We had very detailed return to work calendar data available from WorkSafe BC, so we were able to look in quite a bit of detail at the return to work trajectory. I think the measurement of anxiety and depression, it was a strength of this study, as we had longitudinal data, including from before injury, but it is good to think about the implications for how these were measured for the results. So in general, anxiety and depression are underdiagnosed and undertreated in Canada. So what this means is there could have been workers in the study sample who did have clinical levels of anxiety and depression that actually got categorized in the none group. What this would do to the results is it would actually cause us to underestimate both the presence of anxiety and depression disorders as well as their effect. So by having people with anxiety and depression in the none group, we might have diminished the differences and reported them as smaller than they truly are. Another thing to think about is we used umbrella definitions of anxiety and depression. So there wasn't enough detail in the diagnostic data to look at different types of anxiety disorders and different types of depression disorders. So there is a bit of a range, even within anxiety and depression. So for anxiety, we have, you have panic disorder as well as social anxiety and quite a few others. And it is possible that these individual subtypes of anxiety and depression have different effects. And then our healthcare data was limited to services that were covered by the provincial health plan data. So we didn't have access to privately accessed anxiety and depression treatments. So that would mostly include when people pay for out-of-pocket for a counselor or pay for a counselor through a different insurance system. So that once again could have caused us to underestimate the prevalence and effects of these disorders. It was an observational study. So with any observational study, there is the potential for unmeasured confounders. As you saw in an earlier slide, we were able to account for a large number of confounders, and I'm pretty happy with that. One thing that we didn't have a good estimate for was a worker's psychosocial work conditions. So it is possible that some workers, especially those with anxiety and depression, might have worse psychosocial work conditions, and this could be contributing to them having a lower probability of return to work. We were able to account for these a little bit through adjusting for occupation, as psychosocial work conditions do vary across occupations. However, they do vary within occupations as well. And then lastly, the external generalizability. I think it's just important to keep in mind that this study looked at workers with strain or sprain, and the results might be specific to similar injuries. So in regards to, just the implications of the results, workers with anxiety and depression they comprised a pretty significant portion of the study sample. And I think this means that if mental health, if it does impact return to work, if that is modifiable, this is a rather large group that could be targeted with potential interventions. So I think there is a lot of potential there to potentially reduce work disability by targeting workers with anxiety and depression. We found that both pre-existing and new onset conditions were both associated with a lower probability of sustained return to work. So given that they're associated, I think it would be ideal if both could be incorporated into the case management process for these physical injuries. Currently in British Columbia, an existing anxiety or depression disorder is only included, well, it might be included, but specific treatments for that disorder are only included as a part of the claim if that disorder resulted due to the actual injury itself, or if a pre-existing condition was exacerbated by the injury itself. So anxiety and depression in terms of causation, they tend to be multifactorial. It's very difficult to prove causation. So it might be a good approach to provide support regardless of the cause of the condition, and to include it in the case management process. In regards to the risk factor profiles, I already touched upon this, but I think the fact that anxiety and depression were associated with lower income has and taken into account when you consider, I know in British Columbia, there's very limited access to counseling through our public health system, and especially if you want to take, you know, a longer number of counseling sessions, people often either have to pay out of pocket, or sometimes they're covered through their employer, but not everyone is. So I think the risk factor profile of low income, as well as the complicated clinical profile, has implications that to maybe consider for policy and practice in terms of access to mental health care, as well as the integration of treatment for mental health with physical health treatment. In regards to the timing of support or treatment for mental health disorders for workers that have a physical injury, I think in particular the finding that anxiety and anxiety comorbid with depression are associated with increased risk of time loss recurrence. I think that what suggests is that perhaps that mental health treatment or supports for these workers should start during time loss, but also continue once the worker is back at work. And then lastly, we did see differences for men and women in terms of the impacts on sustained return to work, as well as the risk profiles. So I think this implies that we should give some consideration to gender sensitive approaches. I'm often asked what those might be, and I'm not able to give nearly as good of an answer as I'd like to, because there is quite a lack of literature on that topic. So one example that I can think of for screening is men are often hesitant to, they answer surveys asking directly about their anxiety, depression, and symptoms a little bit differently. So in terms of screening for anxiety and depression in men, it has been recommended to ask questions more so not about the symptoms themselves, but about the work interference. So what work interference might you be experiencing due to things like your mood or your feelings? It would be great if there could be more research on that area. These are two related publications from the research. I do have two more that are working on, but these two are out and available. Here's some references. All right, and then lastly, this is my email. We're going to have a question and answer session, which hopefully will be a very rich discussion, but my email is also available here if you have any follow-up questions after.
Thank you so much, Andrea.